The war is over. The British are gone. The United States of America is finally free. But now what? Winning independence was one thing, governing a brand new country, that was an entirely different challenge. Imagine this. It's 1780s. The economy is in crisis. The government is weak. Farmers are rioting. The states are fighting over land, money, and power. Some are even wondering, did we make a mistake breaking away from the Britain? Something had to change. And so, the founding fathers gathered once again, not to fight a war, but to fix the mess that they have created. The result? A completely new system of government that would shape America for centuries to come, the US Constitution. In this episode, we will break down the Articles of Confederation, the Shays Rebellion, the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution itself, and Bill of Rights. This is the story of how a struggling young nation reinvented itself and created a government that has lasted over 230 years. Welcome to US History, Understanding This Country. We have made it to episode 11, and I want to take a moment to thank all of you for listening, sharing, and supporting this podcast. Your enthusiasm for history keeps this journey alive, and I am so glad to have you here. Alright, let's dive in, because this is where the real fight for America's future begins. When the Founding Fathers declared independence in 1776, they knew they needed a system to hold the colonies, now states, together. They had just broken away from an all powerful king, and the last thing they wanted was another strong central government telling them what to do. So, instead of creating one unified nation, they come up with a loose alliance of 13 independent states. That's what the Article of Confederation were, a government that was weak on purpose. The articles were officially adopted in 1777 and fully approved by all 13 states in 1781, just 2 years before the end of the war. The idea was simple. Each state would mostly govern itself, but they're loosely connected under a national congress. Sounds fair, right? Well, in theory, maybe. But in practice, it was a disaster. Let me put it this way. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States wasn't really one country. It was more like a group of states that agreed to get along, kind of. There was no president to enforce laws, no Supreme Court to settle disputes, and no national military to protect the country. There was only a Congress, where each state got exactly one vote, no matter how big or small it is. That meant the state of Rhode Island had the same power as Virginia, which, as you can imagine, didn't always sit well with the larger states. And if that wasn't bad enough, Congress had almost no real power. It could make laws, sure, but it couldn't actually enforce them. It couldn't collect taxes, so it had to beg the states for money. If the state didn't feel like paying, too bad. The Congress had no control over trade, so states were basically running their own little economies, sometimes even taxing each other like separate countries. Oh, and there was no national currency either. Some states printed their own money, while others still used British pounds. So, depending on where you were, a dollar might not even be worth a dollar. Imagine trying to buy groceries with New Jersey money and being told, sorry, we only take Pennsylvania cash here. That's the kind of chaos we are talking about. And if Congress ever wanted to change the articles to fix any of these problems, they needed all 13 states to agree. Yep, every single one. If just one state said no, the whole plan was dead. As you might have guessed, this system didn't exactly work out. The country wasn't functioning, the economy was a mess. Inflation was out of control. Some states were so broke, they started printing more and more money, making it worthless. Trade between states was a nightmare, and internationally, no one took America seriously because it looked like the whole thing was falling apart. And the military, well, there wasn't a national military. The British, who were supposed to have left after the war, were still occupying forts in the West. And what could Congress do about it? Mm, nothing. They didn't have power to raise an army. But if there was one event that truly exposed how weak the Articles of Confederation were, it was Shays' Rebellion. Let us come back to that in a bit. While the government was struggling, one big thing did go right. America started expanding westward. Now, imagine the United States in 1780s. The original 13 states were mostly packed along the east coast. But there was a huge chunk of land to the west, stretching all the way to the Mississippi River. This land, what we now call the Midwest, was known as the Northwest Territory, and it includes the present day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a little bit of Minnesota. After the Revolution, this land officially belonged to the United States. But there was one big question: how do you organize and settle it? Do states just claim pieces of themselves? Do people just move in and start building? And most importantly, how do you keep it from turning into total chaos? The answer came in the form of two major laws: the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwestern Ordinance of 1787. Okay, let's say you are running the US government in 1785. You are broke because, again, the Articles of Confederation don't let you collect taxes. But you do have one valuable thing: land. So, Congress came up with an idea: why not sell the western land to raise money? But before they could sell it, they had to organize it. That's where the Land Ordinance of 1785 comes in. Here is what it did: instead of people just grabbing land however they wanted, the government decided to divide everything into grid system. They created townships, each one 6 miles by 6 miles, and split those into 36 square mile sections. These sections could then be sold to settlers, land companies, or anyone willing to buy. And here is something important: one section in each township was set aside for public schools, which was a huge deal. This was one of the first times in the history that a government had officially planned for education in new settlements. This system made it easy to buy and sell land in an orderly way. No overlapping claims, no fights over boundaries, no confusion. It was probably one of the smartest things Congress did under the Articles of Confederation. But of course, there was another problem. Just because the US claimed this land didn't mean no one was living there. The Northwestern Territory wasn't empty. Many Native American nations had lived there for centuries, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. As American settlers moved in, tensions escalated quickly. Some tribes signed treaties with the US, while others resisted fiercely, leading to a series of violent conflicts that would eventually come to a head in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. But we'll get to that later. For now, just know this: the expansion into the Northwestern Territory wasn't just about land sales and townships. It was also the beginning of decades of conflicts between the US government and the Native American nations. So, the Land Ordinance of 1785 was the first step in America's expansion westward. It created an organized way to settle land, helped fund the struggling government, and even set the stage for public education in new communities. But organizing land was just the beginning. The bigger question was, how would these new territory become states? That's where the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 comes in. And trust me, it was one of the most important laws in early American history. By the late 1780s, the United States had officially claimed the Northwest Territory, but just because the US government said it was theirs didn't mean it was that simple. This land was already home to powerful Native American nations: the Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, and others who had lived there for generations. These nations weren't about to hand over their land just because some piece of paper said so. And so, in the years after the Revolution, tensions erupted into full scale conflicts between Native American warriors and American settlers. At the heart of this struggle, a brutal battle known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers, a fight that would ultimately lead to the Treaty of Greenville, one of the most significant land agreements in early US history. In the early 1790s, as more American settlers moved into the Northwestern Territory, Native American nations, backed by the British military support, fought to resist. The conflict turned into an all out war between the US Army and a Native American alliance known as the Western Confederacy. At first, the Native warriors were winning. The US sent two military expeditions to stop them, but both were humiliating defeats for the Americans. St. Clair's defeat in 1791 was one of the worst losses in the US military history. Out of nearly 1,000 American troops, over 900 were killed or wounded. After that disaster, President George Washington decided enough was enough. He sent in General Mad Anthony Wayne, a tough, no nonsense military commander, to crush the native resistance once and for all. Wayne trained his troops for an entire year before launching his attack, something unheard of that time. Then, in 1794, the final showdown happened near the Maumee River in Ohio, a place surrounded by fallen trees, giving the battle's name, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The fight was quick and decisive. Wayne's army overpowered the native forces, who retreated, hoping to regroup at the nearby British fort. But this time, the British, who had been secretly supporting them, refused to help. With nowhere to go and no backup, the Native American resistance collapsed. The defeat forced native leaders to the negotiating table, leading to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Treaty of Greenville was a massive land agreement between the US government and several Native American nations. Under the treaty, the native nations agreed to give up most of Ohio and part of Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan in exchange for money and goods. On paper, this looked like a peaceful resolution, but in reality, it was the beginning of large scale land loss for Native Americans. The treaty pushed them further west, and within just a few decades, the lands they had fought so hard to keep were taken over entirely by the American settlers. For the US, the Treaty of Greenville was a turning point. It secured American control over the Northwest Territory and paved the way for even more westward expansion. But for Native Americans, it was a painful reminder that the fight for their land was far from over. While all of this was happening in the Northwest, the rest of the country wasn't exactly thriving. In fact, the US was barely holding itself together in the years after the Revolution. The country was broke. The war had left the US deep in debt, and under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to tax. So, how did the government get the money? It asked the states for donations, which, as you might guess, didn't work too well. Trade was another disaster. Since each state controlled its own trade policies, some were taxing goods from other states, which led to constant disputes. On top of that, the British refused to leave their forts in American territory, violating the Treaty of Paris from 1783. But since the US didn't have a strong national army under the Articles, it couldn't force them out. And the biggest problem, foreign nations didn't take the US seriously. Britain still treated America like a rebellious colony and kept its fort in the Northwest. Spain controlled the Mississippi River and refused to let the American farmers use it for trade. France had helped the US win the war, but now they wanted their money back, and the US had no way to pay. Everything was falling apart. The government was weak, the economy was unstable, farmers were angry, and their frustrations would soon boil over into something that shook the country to its core: Shays' Rebellion. Imagine you just fought in the American Revolution, you risked your life, believed in the cause, and now, after years of war, you finally get to go home. But when you get there, it's worse than when you left. Your farm is drowning in debt. The government is demanding taxes you can't pay. The very country you fought to create is seizing lands from its own citizens. What do? For many farmers in Massachusetts, the answer was simple: you fight back. This was Shays' Rebellion, the moment when the people who won the American Revolution almost started another one. The state government in Massachusetts, desperate to pay off war debts, started raising property taxes. And the ones hit hardest were farmers and former soldiers. Many of these men had been promised payment for their service in the war, but the government had no money, so they were never paid. Now, these same soldiers were being told they owed tax on their land. And if they couldn't pay, the government would seize their farms and throw them in debtors' prisons. To these farmers, It felt like they had just traded one oppressive government for another one, and they weren't going to let that happen without a fight. One of these struggling farmers was a man named Daniel Chase, a former captain in the Continental Army. Like many others, he returned home to find himself buried in debt, with no money and no help from the government he had fought for. In 1786, he and thousands of other angry farmers started organizing protests. They began by blocking courthouses, preventing judges from issuing foreclosure orders on their land. Their message was clear: if the courts can't meet, they can't take our farms. But soon, things escalated. By 1787, Chase and his followers had armed themselves and marched towards Springfield, Massachusetts, planning to seize the federal arsenal. If they got their hands on those weapons, the rebellion would turn into a full scale revolution. But the Massachusetts government wasn't about to let that happen. The state sent a militia privately funded by wealthy merchants to stop the rebels. In January 1787, the two sides clashed and the rebellion was quickly crushed. Several rebels were killed and others were arrested. Daniel Chase himself fled to Vermont, though he was later pardoned. You might be thinking, okay, so it was a bunch of angry farmers and the government stopped them. What's the big deal? Here is why Shays' rebellion was a massive deal. It exposed the biggest weakness of the Articles of Confederation. See, the federal government under the Articles was so weak that it couldn't even respond to an internal rebellion. Congress had no power to raise an army, no money to help struggling states, and no way to stop uprisings like this. The only reason the rebellion ended was because Massachusetts state militia handled it, not the national government. This fact terrified the founding fathers. If the government couldn't even protect itself from its own citizens, what would happen if a foreign power attacked? For many leaders, this was a breaking point. They realized the Articles of Confederation weren't working. If the US was going to survive, it needed a new system of government, one that was strong enough to handle crisis, maintain order, and unify the country. And so, later that year, in the summer of 1787, delegates from all over the country gathered in Philadelphia to fix the articles. But instead of fixing them, they scrapped them entirely. What came next? The United States Constitution. 55 men arrived in Philadelphia, representing 12 of 13 states. Rhode Island didn't show up. They wanted nothing to do with creating a stronger government. But the men who did come were some of the most influential minds in the American history. George Washington was chosen to preside over the convention. He didn't say much, but his presence alone gave legitimacy to the process. Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old at that time, acted as the wise elder, keeping tempers from flaring too much. Alexander Hamilton argued for a strong national government, while James Madison, quiet but brilliant, had come prepared with a plan, one that would eventually shape the entire Constitution. These men weren't just revising a document, they were about to build a new country on paper. One of the biggest debates in the convention was over representation. The question was simple: how should states be represented in the new government? But the answer, not so simple. The large states wanted a system where representation was based on population, meaning bigger states like Virginia and Pennsylvania would have more power. They called this the Virginia Plan, and it made sense to them. More people, more representation. But smaller states like New Jersey and Delaware saw this as a direct threat. If representation was based on population, they would have almost no voice in the new government. They wanted a system where every state had equal representation, no matter its size. This became the New Jersey Plan. For weeks, the two sides were at a stalemate. The convention was on the verge of collapse until a compromise was proposed. Roger Sherman of Connecticut suggested a two-house Congress, a House of Representatives based on population, which satisfied the bigger states, and a Senate where every state got equal representation, which satisfied the smaller states. This became known as the Great Compromise, and it saved the convention from falling apart. This decision shaped the structure of Congress and remains in place to this day. Another major debate was over the executive branch. The delegates agreed that there needed to be a leader, but they had just fought a war against a king, and the last thing they wanted was another one. Some wanted a weak executive, a figurehead with little power, while others, like Hamilton, believed in a strong, decisive leader. After much debate, they created the office of president. This leader would be elected, serve for 4 years, and have powers that were strong, but not absolute. To prevent the rise of a dictatorship, they built in checks and balances, ensuring that no one branch of government could dominate the others. Under the Articles of Confederation, the economy had been a disaster. Congress couldn't raise taxes. States were taxing each other's goods, and there was no national currency. The new constitution fixed this by giving the federal government the power to tax, regulate trade, and create a unified economic system. It may not sound dramatic, but this decision is what turned the US from a collection of bickering states into a functioning economy. After months of debate, on September 17, 1787, the final draft of the United States Constitution was signed. It was a radical document for its time, one that established a government built on the will of the people, not a monarchy. It created a system of laws that could be changed through amendments, ensuring it could evolve as the country grew. But not everyone was happy. Some believed the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government and didn't do enough to protect the individual rights. Others believed it didn't go far enough. The real battle wasn't over. The Constitution was written, now it needed to be approved. Would the states accept this new form of government? Would Americans embrace or reject the Constitution? And what about those who demanded a Bill of Rights? Before we go to the Bill of Rights, let us talk about something else. One of the trickiest parts of the early American history is keeping track of all the different congresses. You hear the names like Continental Congress, Confederation Congress, and Constitutional Convention, and it all starts blending together. So let's clear this up because each one played a crucial role, and getting them mixed up can make the story of America's founding a little confusing. The Continental Congress was the wartime government, which was between 1774 and 1781. It organized the colonies' resistance against the Britain, signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and it managed the Revolutionary War. The Confederation Congress, the first attempt at the government, was between 1781 and 1789. This was the result of the Articles of Confederation. This was America's first real government, but as we have already covered, it was incredibly weak. It couldn't even tax citizens, regulate the trade between states, or enforce any laws. After Shays' rebellion, many leaders realized that the Articles of Confederation weren't just weak, they were completely unworkable. So they called for a special meeting to fix them, and that is Constitutional Convention. This happened in 1787, and it was in this convention US Constitution was written. This in turn created a new government, and that is the one we still see in the US. And that's the episode, folks. I had a lot more prepared for this episode, but since this episode is already more than 20 minutes, I am wrapping this up. But when I see you next week, we have more details about the US Constitution's nuances, articles, and the core concepts. The fact is, many nations got inspired by the US Constitution, including India, which modeled her constitution based on the US Constitution. India's fundamental rights, judicial review system, and the rigid constitution were direct influence of the US Constitution. Let us hear about that in the next episode. If you liked this episode, show your love by dropping a comment or feedback, sharing it with your friends and families, or any students who are studying the US history. I am delighted to be narrating these stories for you. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep exploring.